First thing I'd like to call on all of you to do after leaving here is to talk to at least 10 people outside of our education bubble to inform them about what is happening, because the mass public, they really don't know what's happening. And what is happening is that education has become a huge trillion-dollar industry. It's being taken over by corporations. And instead of funds going to K-12, going to community colleges, going to UC, going to CSU, they are being outsourced to consultants. Consultants has become a huge industry. So as Steve said, I was a government attorney for the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing, and they don't just license teachers, they also license school administrators. They work with the CSU and other institutes of higher education to approve teacher preparation programs and school administrator programs. They monitor those programs. They're supposed to be monitoring proper assignments. And I definitely did see a lot of things. I'm not going to talk about that. There's YouTube videos on that if you choose to watch them. What I am going to talk about today is the problem that I have seen and I am working with other people up in Sacramento, and I have literally seen a very, very ugly pattern of people that are in key political decision-making positions that have aligned themselves or are themselves either lobbyists for corporate clients or are involved some way in making profit for these corporate interests that are involved in the education industry. An example is the Strategic Education Services. They have as their client City College of San Francisco, Santa Monica College, LAUSD, and also Connections Academy, LLC. Connections Academy is the second largest online education company in the country. It's now owned by Pearson. How many of you have heard of Pearson? Okay. Pearson is the large international global testing company. In 2006, in addition to publishing and testing, they went into the assessment business by buying out National Computer Systems. Bill Gorth was the founder of NCS, and so actually if you look up Pearson, it's NCS Pearson, and that's why, because in 2006 they bought National Computer System, and they're headquartered not here in the United States, they're headquartered in London. So that's where their headquarters are, but they have offices all over the world, and they are privatizing, and not just by testing everyone to death, but by assessments. And it's not just teacher evaluations and tying teacher evaluations to student tests. It's data-driven, basically profit-driven data. And they're heavily involved. They have a contract with Stanford University and a company called Achieve Inc. And through the funding by JP Morgan Chase, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Lumina Foundation, they designed the Common Core standards. And a lot of people don't realize that. I don't know if many of you know who Lumina Foundation is. Lumina is a very large nonprofit entity, and nonprofits have really entered the field. They're so-called nonprofit, but actually they're essentially funneling a lot of public funds, and they're getting private philanthropy foundations in collaboration with them. They don't pay taxes. Lumen is a conversion foundation. It used to be, I can't remember the name now, USA Corporation, you can Wikipedia it, but they basically, the majority of their assets were student loans. So they sold $1 billion worth of student loan assets when they converted to Lumina to Sallie Mae. And if you look at their board, they have a lot of people in the student loan industry. One interesting thing to note for those of you that are UC folks is Mark Udoff sits on the board. Mark Udoff is the president of UC. He sits on the board of the Lumina Foundation. And so when I say that our public key decision makers are sitting on the boards of these privatization entities, they are. And I don't know how much room we were going to have, but I was going to show you.
No, I was going to take this footage.
Okay. We have literally connected tons and tons of organizations. We're putting them into databases and connecting the dots, both at the state level and at the national level, of how many of our government officials, and when I say government officials, I'm not just saying senators and assembly member and our governor, I'm also saying city council members, school board members. How many of you know of EdVoice? EdVoice? Okay, EdVoice is a top campaign contributor in the state of California. It was founded by then Assembly member Ted Lambert and former insurance commissioner Steve Poizner. On the board used to sit, I don't know if he's still on there, Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix. He also sits on the board of Facebook. He also sits on the board of the California Charter School Association. He is heavily involved. He's heavily involved in rocket ship learning. Rocket ship learning uses this IT entity called Dreambox for their interactive model. Basically, the IT world has infiltrated into the education industry, and they are just coming up with ideas by the minute on how they can produce data, how they can produce tests, how they can assess student performance. It's really, they're outsourcing to just numerous organizations. How many of you have heard of the organization WestEd? Okay. When we hear about the fact that we have a budget crisis, of course that needs to be questioned after recently you probably read in the paper that $2 billion has been found. WestEd is an organization which is considered a public agency, and yet numerous school districts, county office of eds, and numerous foundations such as Gates, JP Morgan, Lumina, all these entities are funding WestEd. So if we did away with all these nonprofits and all these so-called consultants and lobbyists who literally have conflicts with people that are sitting, there are actually active lobbyists sitting on elected school boards when they represent clients such as K-12 Inc. and Rocket Ship Learning. That's actually happening, but no one's doing anything about it. And so I propose to you, and I have been at a number of events now, that we need to build a statewide coalition. We can't attack everything. This is happening worldwide, it's certainly happening nationwide, but we need to build a statewide coalition so we have a group of people ready to go to do our own ballot initiative. I propose repealing all charter school laws. Albert Schenker had a wonderful conception and an idea when he initially proposed it in 1988, and it would be an incubator for educators to share best practices, but unfortunately that has been taken over by the corporate interests. It's just been completely taken over, and it's siphoning off funds, and that's why teachers are losing their jobs. They're getting laid off, and they're being laid off in such a way that tenure is being skipped and rules are being violated and collective bargaining agreements are just tossed away, and they're not, and there's just lawsuits and more and more money. So we need to stop it. We need to really put an end to it, and we need to put an end to our tax dollars being given to consultants, lobbyists, for-profit groups. That just needs to stop. They need to stay. We need to keep the state and state universities. We need to keep the community and community colleges, and we need to keep K-12 education, pre-K to 12, public. And unless we really build a coalition and act now, it's going to disappear because the industry's already there. And I'd be happy to talk to people and show. I've actually have 2 years worth of annual reports from WestEd just to show you the types of entities that are actually giving money. And then we're talking public money, in addition to them combining forces with the big three, which is Eli Broad, Walton, which is the Walmart Group, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has combined their monies with Warren Buffett. So that's the huge big three, but there's other entities. Michael Milken, how many of you have heard of him? Okay, he was convicted. He's a felon. He was charged on 98 counts of racketeering, inside trading, and securities fraud, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He pled down to only 6 counts and he was sentenced to 10, but only served 2 years in prison in a facility here in Pleasanton. And now, what did he do? He is the founder, along with former Ronald Reagan's Education Secretary William Bennett. He founded K-12 Inc. So that is the largest online education company in the country, and it went public in 2007, and it's now being publicly traded. And they're getting our tax dollars. So we have literally corrupt individuals that have infiltrated at every single level. How many of you know Scott Himmelstein? Okay, Scott Himmelstein sits on the board of governors in the community college district. He's the president. Okay, many of you may not know he's a bad actor. He was down in San Diego City schools when Alan Burson was burnt. You just look Alan Burson up, and you'll see numerous articles of how teachers were literally tormented. He was forced out of San Diego City schools. Scott Himmelstein was funneling public funds into his little nonprofit called San Diego Reads, and there was a huge scandal. And then he shows up in Sacramento as Deputy Secretary of Education under Alan Burson. Alan Burson was Secretary of Education in Sacramento. He was forced out. I mean, there's numerous scandals revolving Alan Burson and Scott Himmelstein, and now they show up in another place. Where? In our community colleges. These people are all over. So I really encourage all of you. I think that the K-12 people have always focused separately from the higher ed. I really encourage people, all of you, to speak to 10 people and really encourage people to work together, because they have a lot of money. But guess what? We have numbers. We are the many, they are the few, and we can do this. We can really do this. We need to take back public education and keep it public. Thank you. Leadership and policy, which was funded by private corporations, including the Lumina Foundation and State Farm and JP Morgan Chase, that was started at CSU Sacramento. Again, with our public funds. So they have infiltrated in key government policy decision makers. They are our decision makers. So we're hearing a lot of gloom and doom today, but let's all, and I think I had a sign around sheet, I don't know where it is now, but let's all make an effort to talk to 10 people who are outside the bubble. Yes, we hear a lot about teachers being vilified. They're being tortured. I'm getting contacted by teachers across the country, not just here in California. They're being taken out of their job for literally questioning a principal and given no due process, and now they're in poverty after they've lost their car and their home and sometimes their marriage. I mean, this is what's really happening. And people who currently have their job, they don't know about the teachers who've lost their job and what they've gone to, because if they dare speak to them, those teachers sometimes are fearing retaliation, and it's real. It's sad. It's really, really happening. And there have been suicides over this. It's really sad, but we need to do something. And I am willing, as an attorney, and I also live in Sacramento, so all the agencies are close to me, I am willing to dig. I am going to name names. I'm going to do the spin. I'm going to follow the money. And I do that by going to the Fair Political Practices Commission, Secretary of State, and I literally go there and I am digging up quite a bit of information and naming names. And we all need to, and the reason that that's important is we need to know who we can trust. Because EdVoice is backing these people in the school boards, in the Senate, in the Assembly. EdVoice backed Alex Padilla. What did Alex Padilla author that thank God didn't pass? Senate Bill 1530, which would have stripped teachers of their due process rights. I was there that day, and I spoke up, as well did Pat Rucker, who's a lobbyist for CTA, and numerous teachers from Sacramento filed declaration and was there to speak on behalf of their colleagues and their brothers and sisters down in Los Angeles who are literally being torn apart by what's happening, which is a lot of which is a charade. John Deasy is a Broad alum. So I want to put together a ballot initiative. There are legislators who want to strip us of the initiative process after what happened with Molly Munger and the oil tax initiative. And Darrell Steinberg is one of the people who has come out and saying he wants to do away with the initiative process. I say no. We need to coalesce. We need to build a movement, all of us. Every one of you that belongs to a group, I say, great. The more, the better. But we need to get the message out, and we need to build together. Higher ed, K-12, adult ed, pre-K. We need to talk to parents. We need to talk to community activists. We need to talk to the citizenry at large so we can have this ballot initiative. So when it comes time for the signatures, and you're given a short window of time, I don't know if you know about the ballot initiative process, but you're given only a couple months to come up with a lot of signatures. And Jerry Brown spent millions of dollars on his drive. He had paid initiatives. He had a consulting firm. He paid people to become signature gatherers, and he spent a lot of money doing it for his tax initiative. I'm personally against it because of the way it's drafted. And also I see a lot of defunding of public education going to these private entities and consultants. But the legislature really is to blame because when they drafted the budget this year, they put in these trigger cuts, these horrible trigger cuts. And what did they target? They target public education and low-income programs. They didn't need to do that. They absolutely didn't need to do that. So we really need to coalesce. I am going to email all of you that have email. I put together a group. We're now only 131 people. I have made contacts literally across the country, thousands of people I am in contact with, everyone from Chicago, and I know Karen Lewis has been doing a great job, from Pennsylvania to Oregon. I mean, it's literally, I've been in contact with teachers and activists across the country, and we do need to build a nationwide movement, but we have to do what we can do practically. And in California, we need to build a statewide movement so we can get an initiative on the ballot to stop their funding source. We can't break up what's already there. I mean, we can try, but it's going to be difficult. But we can do is a ballot initiative because, as I said before, we are the many, they are the few, and we're going to fight back.
I'm responsible for a table full of handout sheets. And since I want you to take them, really what I'm going to do is just introduce those rather than go into a lot of details. There are 4 parts to them. But I wanted to start with a quote that I've always liked by Thomas Carlyle, written in 1839. I'll give you the context in a minute. He said in 1839 that there should one man die ignorant who had the capacity to learn. This I call a tragedy. To impart the gift of thinking to those who cannot think and yet who could, in that case, think, this, one would imagine, was the first function a government had to set about discharging. I looked up the context of this idea of universal education for life, which is the community college concept. He wrote it in an essay about Chartism. The Chartism movement from 1839 to 1840, actually 1838 to 1848, was considered the first real working union. It's the roots of our unions, our working class unions. The first aspect of their chart was the vote. We need the vote. Because it was in the early 19th century, it was the vote for men. Later on, the suffragettes took the same charter in a sense and extended it and took the color code, and this is a sidebar, but I just found all this out last night, had to do this. The color code for both the earliest union and the suffragettes was lavender, green, and white. Years ago, I bought some antique jewelry, and no one knew much about it. But I looked at it last night, and it's lavender, green, and white. This was taken from the charters to the suffragettes, and I thought I would wear it in honor of this early union and women's rights, of course. Besides, I like to wear things that are older than I am. Now, the first handout series, speaking of ALEC and Lumina, there's a group, if you Google, and I've gotten too much into this, a group called the Badger Democracy out of Wisconsin. On the table are 3 articles, recent articles of their investigation with ALEC, you all know ALEC and Lumina, and what's going on lately. And by the way, the Wisconsin folks are really a good group to keep in touch with. They really have the research on ALEC and all this stuff. And while California, we need to know what's going on here. It is a national movement, and the middle of the country has really been under attack. The second article, for example, is when the Koch brothers' heading is "Buys the Right to Interfere in Faculty Hiring" at Florida State. Terrible cautionary tale there. Then recently, the New York Times has what Lumina has as the new community college try. Reading this is just chilling as to what they think the new community college should be. I'm sorry, but when I read it, the immediate thing that came to my mind was Arbeit macht frei. It's horrible what they intend to do to our students, horrible. And then the last is this kind of way they have, it's called drill baby, it's for the children, of talking about the layer ploy. Because I have been trying to connect the dots with big oil and education. And in many cases, well, in some cases, like in Alaska and Texas, the oil taxes pay for higher ed, but then the oil people get away with fracking, this kind of stuff. So we have to be very careful that when they start bailing out higher ed, it's not at some other kind of cost. Just no good folks out there in that field. I grew up in Kern County, I know about oil. Anyway, then the second group, since I am from City College and there's so much going on, I just left 2 things on the table. One was a pretty good article from the Bay Guardian called "City College Fights Back." And I think this gives you a lot of the details. There's still a few things that we'd have to clear up factually, but it's a good article. I also put out something on the table that I did, taking what the accreditation reports comes through, and you write a self-study, and then a team comes in and goes through what you've said and investigates and so forth. When you take the 66 pages, and truly I cherry-picked, I took what I call the cup half full. These are selected excerpts from the evaluation report of the WASP visiting team, and this is the good news. And this is not what gets reported, but this is all verbatim. I didn't change anything. So you might find that useful as we go more into the drama that's currently going on at City College, and it is a drama, but we'll get there. And then I think later on the panel, you'll have a lot of information about the takeover or attempted takeover by the virtual schools and what's out there in terms of the virtual education scene. the articles now recently, well, these actually go back a year or two, but there's a lot of research that shows that online education alone, I back up, if it's computer-enhanced education, live plus computer, great stuff. But if it's fully online, there's now a lot of research. I'll just read the titles, tells you, they're all on the back table. Online and incomplete. Community college students perform worse online than face-to-face. Online community college, these are all different writers. Online community colleges more likely to fail. Outsourcing education, the rise of the virtual school, which contains the failures. Why are so many students still failing online? Full-time online learning is detrimental to student success. I mean, come on, folks. How much more of this research before we realize this is what is it, pig in a poke? I mean, this is a bad situation. I did include an article that extols the wonders of online, and it goes on about being able to teach thousands of students, but when you do the math on the first page and you have a course that has 104,000 students signed in, 13,000 completed, that's a 7.6 completion rate. When we have face, we have 65, 70% completion rate. And that's the plus article, they say. And then, this is a dot I haven't connected yet. Curious, the WASC, Mission on Accrediting, has a recent list this month showing all the community colleges that are in various sanctions. There are whole bunches of us. And then the last 2 pages, for the first time, shows a lot of colleges who have, through WASC now, because WASC is the one that puts this into place, are now offering online associate degrees and certificate programs. The reason WASC is doing it and not the state of California is that somehow have said, well, since online cross-distance, you guys get to be the ones to say if these are courses. So you see a whole list of courses, of schools that are offering, in some cases, the first one, 87 associate degrees and 13 certificate programs they've approved, despite all these headlines. And then it's just funny, as a friend of mine would say, coinky-dink, that none of the schools that are offering all these online courses are on any of the sanctions. Strange. So we'll look into that. And then the last thing I would like to mention is my own little hobby horse. And I've thought about this, and I thought, I got to say it, folks. And I guess I've got to out who I am. I'm a concert pianist. I grew up, if you've read The Outliers, I've done my 10,000 hours. I fell in love with the community college system on the cusp of a fairly national career. I don't regret that, because I think this is really good stuff. And I love playing for my students. I just adore that. I love my students, that's why I switched. But I am a concert pianist, and I have always pursued the idea of what about the brain? What the right, the famous right brain, left brain stuff. And as a musician, and a lifelong musician, I started when I was 5, what is it about the brain and children in the brain and so forth? In the 80s in particular, I worked with Dr. Frank Wilson on the midbrain kind of research. I found it when I started Googling a hoot that I am in the Google machine next to his name on some stuff we did together in the 80s. I didn't know that, and I am on that. I am M. Mueller. So I'm here today still as M. Mueller. That's how you find me. I have many names. But I wrote a while back in September, Connecting the Dots by M. Mueller, because it's my persona as a musician and as a brain researcher. And I included some updated research about the brain, which is fascinating stuff. And it ties in with, I've always had an interest in all schooling as to how appropriately to deal with the brain as you're teaching children. There's still work to be done here. In public schooling, we've come along. The private school that's taken over by the moneyed interest could care less. But we do need to keep always in mind that research, which will show not just children, but adults, what is the best time for what kind of educational approach. And so I have an article here where there is a kind of a caution by, called The End of Public Education, the New American Revolution. And he ends with the idea that public schooling, after all, is not worth fighting for if it is merely a minor reform aiding the maintenance of an unjust status quo. That's a strong statement, but I think we have to keep it in mind. I started doing brain research in the 70s with Gene Houston's writings saying that we have to be careful, we might be brain damaging our children. I use the analogy to get back to the Industrial Revolution, which, by the way, was built on child labor and has dark roots. Child labor, they finally came out with that children weren't the academic or the economic plus that they were by treating a child, and in the 19th century they figured this out. You treat a child as a little adult, you send them into the fields and the coal mines and whatever, and they give you more profit because they eat less. You know, there's a book out now that says the Industrial Revolution was based on child labor. Not good stuff. But we got child labor laws that recognized that children are not in body little adults. I think in the 20th century and the 21st century, we have to be careful not to treat child's brains as little adults. The child brain is not a little adult. The idea that you get to the computer sooner than later with children is horrible, horrible. It brain damages. We've got to have new labor laws. As we see what's happening here is that children and adults are being pushed into this machine, much as they were in the 19th century in a real machine. Now it's a techno machine. That's wrong. We've got to fight that. At the same time we're fighting all this stuff. We've got to fight it. And I leave you with my very best favorite article headline, "The brain just gets better after 40." Thank you.
So my question to begin my presentation here on adult education is, what is the biggest privatization movement we've seen so far? Anybody have an answer to that? Of course I have the answer. Huh? What's the biggest privatization movement? Actually, it's colonialism, okay? Colonialism. In the 1400s, starting with the Portuguese and the Spanish, they went all over the planet privatizing everything, including human beings. 11 million Africans, millions of Asians, including Europeans as well, okay? What Karl Marx called the rosy dawn of capitalism. Capitalism is privatization. It is the expropriation of other people's wealth for the enhancement, the enrichment of a few. And then, of course, these few compete with each other, creating, a kind of an anarchistic situation. We have socialized production where things are made by billions of people and controlled by a small number of people who compete with each other, and leads to crisis and all these things. I wanted to say this because I want to, push the perspective a little bit broader. When we talk about the privatization of education, we have to look at it in the context of this bigger system that we're living in. A system of exploitation of human labor. This is the beginning of it all. And even our education system, even in the best of times, our education system was a system that was serving that function, okay? So we did have an education system that was publicized, if you made public, whatever, public institution. With the growth of industrialization in the United States, the need for trained workers and managers and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing is that, and after World War II, and we saw this in California, that as the U.S. emerged out of that war as the dominant power in the world, its economy was growing and so on, it had a growing need for trained workers, scientists, and so on. So we did have in California a fairly robust public education system, and myself and a lot of the other people here with gray hair probably were recipients of that system because we were able to go to school free, virtually free, all the way through university. And of course, that's all being reversed, okay? Because this, the system is in a different phase. I don't understand all the ins and outs of that. I'm trying to understand that better. But there is a fundamental underlying cause of this. It's not just, some greedy people that suddenly, came into the picture, but it is a system that we're talking about, and I think it's important to us to try to understand it. So I want to talk a little bit about adult education, just briefly. Adult schools really began in California. That's my understanding of adult school. I don't know too much about the rest of the country, but adult education began in California not that long after California was seized as part, along with a number of other states, from Mexico. And in 1849, the gold rush and so on, thousands of people were coming to California for various reasons. And many of them, of course, were non-English speaking and so on. Adult schools actually began in 1856 right here in San Francisco. And the first students, my understanding of reading some of the history, is Italians, Irish, I'm not exactly sure but why, but and Chinese. And this early part of California history, I think a lot of you probably know already, was a history very much racially dominated by white supremacy. And the system that and it was inherited from the South, the slave system of the South was brought here to California. So you had anti-miscegenation laws, which meant that non-white people could not intermarry with white people and so on. And it was all attuned to the agricultural system, which was the biggest industry in California. So by and large, non-Europeans were excluded from adult education. In other words, adult education wasn't really aimed at them. I just wanted to say, to backtrack here a second, today in California, adult education is under extreme attack. Just to give you an example of where we've come from and where we're going, there were, in 1950, 1 out of every 10 people living in California was attending adult school. There was a million adult students. There were roughly 10 million people. Today, that ratio is more like 1 in 50. We've gone from where in the 90s we had about 2.5 million adult students, both in the K through 12 districts, as other people have referred to, the K through 12, and the non-credit community college. Okay. Today, that's closer to 1 million students. So we've come from 2.5 million to 1 million. And I've been calling this attack on adult education, we're like collateral damage in the war against public education, because adult schools have not been specifically targeted, as we've seen among K through 12. The adult school teachers are not vilified in the same way, or adult schools are not being accused of being fiscally unresponsible or any of that kind of thing. And we had a situation in Los Angeles, for example, just recently, where the adult school there, which has something like 200,000 to 300,000 students, 26% of the Los Angeles Unified School District, 26% of the student body were adult students, and they were using 2% of the budget of the LA Unified School District, and that didn't prevent them from being the target of being totally shut down. They weren't shut down completely because of the resistance that was put up there by the teachers and the students. Thousands got involved. To go back a little bit on the history, so I have another question, one more question for you, and that is, what two important events took place related to immigration in 1882? What was it? Okay, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the other one? Okay, the Statue of Liberty put in the harbor. Okay, so that gives you a kind of a contrast there. Yeah, I just wanted to. So anyway, I think this is important. This background information on adult education. Adult education begins to change. Direction begins to change, and its student body begins to change in the 1960s. As the United States emerged from World War II as the dominant power, there was also, as you recall, liberation movements, anti-colonial movements all over the planet, in Africa and Asia and so on. There was revolution in China. There was, the U.S. was facing competition from, a country at least posed as a socialist country in the Soviet Union and so on. So the laws that U.S., Jim Crow laws in the South and the very racist immigration laws were becoming an obstacle to U.S.'s being able to compete in that environment and to pose as a democratic alternative to the liberation struggles that were going on around the world and socialism and stuff. So there was pressure even in the ruling circles to change things. And as a result, in the 60s, immigration laws changed dramatically, and we began what we see now as the radical demographic shift. We see that, of course, in California. And this was considered by a lot of people that are, you read interviews with people who were adult educators back in the 60s, they call that the golden age. There was a lot of money being thrown into adult education because, if you were going to have to allow these, unwanted immigrants to come here anyway, let's Americanize them, whatever. And so you had that, but you also had an influx of people who were influenced by the 60s and influenced by those social movements and influenced by that progressive sentiment, also becoming teachers. So you had a mix of things. It wasn't just one thing, but adult schools then during the 60s become more and more larger. They become larger. They sort of extend the range of classes that they offer. And this sort of goes along until around 1978, when you had Proposition 13. And I'd heard about Proposition 13, but when I started thinking about this history, it occurred to me, and maybe there are people here that know more about this than I do, but it occurred to me that 1978, what was happening in our public schools? You had this shift in demographics, and the children of immigrants are starting to go to school, right? And then you had this groundswell of, sort of conservative, middle class, whatever, people saying, no, we don't want to pay for those schools anymore. These are children that don't look like our children or whatever, right? I mean, I think that was an aspect of it. And so Proposition 13 in 1978 really devastated public education in general, but specifically also adult schools. There was a struggle over this, and other sources of funding were found. It so happens at the same time, of course, that California is becoming more and more dependent on immigrant labor. So there's a countervailing force there to keep public schools, adult schools going. And so this, as the privatization of public education begins to kick in, George Bush, the No Child Left Behind, all that stuff, and there's more and more pressure put on public schools, public K through 12 schools, there's also pressure on adult schools. So that's all going along. And when the financial, situation takes place in 2007, a dramatic increase in pressure on the schools. And what happened was under, this is Schwarzenegger's the governor, but it was a bipartisan grouping of people decided this. There was a committee came together and decided that in the face of these fiscal problems, cutting back on education, they were going to take the adult school funds that had previously been earmarked specifically for adult education, and they put them together along with other categoricals in one big pot. So then it became a situation where adult education was now was in a fight with public schools, with their adults against their own children, literally in some respects. So this is what's happened since 2007, 2008. The flexibility, they call it flexibility, so that the funding now is the superintendents of these various districts that have been spoken about. They have control of these funds, and as the pressure comes down on K through 12 schools to keep their, programs for their children going, it's the adult schools that end up losing the funds because adults education doesn't have a lot of even public recognition, let alone a lot of say or power. So what has happened, I just want to talk about a recent survey of school districts found that 30 of the largest school districts, 23 had significant cuts to adult education. And I just wanted to point out one district in particular, and I will talk about a few others, but Anaheim. Anaheim, at a 73-year-old adult school, was closed in 2011, totally closed in 2011. They had a $2 million budget. Anaheim is the home of the Magic Kingdom. They have 16 million people go a year to Disneyland, and they couldn't find $2 million to keep their adult school open. So I thought that was, and then we've seen what happened recently in Anaheim with the three now. 3 people have been shot by the police, 2 murdered by the police. So, I mean, I think that there's a connection between these things, and between the closing of our educational system, closing down of our educational system, the closing of opportunity in all different spheres of life, and the increased police activity and targeting of young people. Okay, and all right. So I am going to try to wind it up here. I just want to talk about a couple of examples of privatization directly of adult education. One of them is in Oakland, where the most charterized school charterized school system in California is Oakland, and their adult school was almost completely shut down. Another example is Los Angeles, which I mentioned, where there's a lot of talk about how charter schools are looking for to utilize those buildings that are being abandoned by adult education. And another one is in Watsonville, where the entire adult education facility was moved out of a building that they themselves built and turned over to Reed Hastings charter school. It's called the Saba College Prep. And this is a little blurb from their website where it says, Beacon, which is the name of their school, or Beacon, I guess is the name of their charter, is a community-based nonprofit dedicated to creating a world where all students are equipped with the skills and knowledge they need to live a happy, productive lives. And you have to wonder what they mean by when they're shutting down the schools for the parents, and creating dividing people against each other. Okay, I just want to say one thing. Adult educators have resisted to some extent, but our resistance has been very limited. And I have a couple of reasons I think that's been the case. One is because there's been a general ignorance of the privatization movement that was spoken to in the very beginning. People don't understand this privatization thing. I tell you myself personally, it's been about in the last year and a half or so that I became aware of it. There's been a divide and conquer, as I mentioned, adult schools versus K through 12. There's been defensiveness around immigrants, and I know this among myself at times, and my colleagues especially. Let's not talk about that we educated immigrants because they're going to get more heat down on us, right? And there's been a certain amount of fatalism, and there's also this buying into this capitalist idea that education has got to have some kind of a target to enrich some corporation somehow down the line by training people in a certain way so that they can utilize them. Education is not really viewed as something that has intrinsic value as human beings, as necessary for us to solve our problems, our growing problems as human beings on this planet. We need an educated population at all levels, and I think that's what we have to stand up and defend. So we as David, one of my colleagues back here, we have been working in San Mateo. We had a press conference, brought together adult schools from different parts of the Bay Area, and we are in the process of trying to begin to develop a broader-based defense of adult education. We have a sign-up sheet in the back. If you're interested in getting information about adult education, we could, we're going to start a Yahoo group. We're going to try to bring in adult educators and others who are interested in this in becoming involved. So, and finally, in conclusion, I just want to say that as we need to build a resistance movement that's part of a revolutionary movement that recognizes the central problem is this system of exploitation that values humans only as sources of profit, a system that does not operate for the benefit of humanity, nor the well-being of the planet, only the accumulation of wealth for a few. It's going to take establishment of a new system based on new values that brings forward a new economic and social system that ends the era of human exploitation, that will bring about the kind of elevating education system that humanity needs to become fully human. And that we, as I said before, face enormous challenges.
I'm basically a longtime public school parent. My younger daughter graduated last year from Oakland Public Schools, and several years ago I became really bothered by the fact that we had a state takeover, and all the superintendents, the state administrators were from the Broad Foundation, which is one of these big players, these big foundations. They had all been trained at the Superintendent's Academy. Anyway, and then watching the school district and all the charter schools coming in, and just, I actually worked as a parent coordinator part-time at my daughter's local middle school. And I was really bothered by all this propaganda and this misinformation, just by some of the things I knew from the inside of what the charter schools were doing to draw students away from my daughter's public schools. So I just started doing all this research. I thought, okay, I'm going to make a blog. One day, I had a couple of blogs. I thought, okay, I'm going to make a blog for charter school scandals. So I just started into this whole thing, just stumbled into it by Googling charter school stories, charter school problems, charter school complaints, et cetera, and right away popped up this whole world. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I know. On May 13th, 60 Minutes broadcast a report about a Turkish religious group that operates a chain of charter schools in Texas. The group is the Gulen movement. Other reports have presented the association too. For instance, in 2001 by the New York Times in a lengthy piece by a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist. In 2010 by the New Republic in an article entitled The Global Imam. And in 2009 in a PhD dissertation by a student who went on to become a professor at Loyola University in Maryland and who is now recognized as a Gulen movement expert. Of particular interest is that the association was mentioned at a 2010 meeting in Amsterdam called Mapping the Gulen Movement. The Gulen Movement sponsors different events around the world to promote Fethullah Gulen and the work of his followers, and this was one of those. At the presentation, a University of Houston professor who has become friendly with the Gulen Movement announced, "Do you know in Texas we now have 25 Gulen schools? They're called charter schools, totally financed by the state. And it's causing problems." I mean, this is really how she intonated it, because I've watched this video so many times. Okay, so all those things should be pretty much enough to confirm that there is a connection between the Gulen movement and certain charter schools, but here is what is very odd, is that the management organization that oversees those schools repeatedly denies being connected to the Gulen movement. Those denials are so strange to me because there's a huge amount of evidence that connects the Gulen movement's famous global educational effort, I mean, this is what the movement is known for, to a sizable number of American charter schools. So Texas is not the only state with Gulen charter schools. Last school year, 26 states had actively operating schools, 135 schools in all, which makes this the largest charter school network in the country. The next largest is KIPP with 109 schools. It's been calculated that during the 2010-11 school year, Gulen's charter schools enrolled nearly 45,000 American students. The schools were funded with a total of about $400 million. These are your tax dollars at work. And all those numbers will be increasing because several more schools are due to open this year, and applications for even more schools for the following year have already been submitted. The Gulen movement opened its first 2 charter schools in Ohio in 1999. And by 2002, they had reached 8 states, including California, where they opened their first school in the San Fernando Valley within the LA Unified School District. Today, California has 13 active Gulen charter schools. Texas has the most schools with 40, and Ohio is next with 19. Now, some of our government officials have known about this group's involvement in charter schools since at least 2006, when the U.S. consulate in Istanbul noticed that a large number of Turkish men suspected to be Gulen movement affiliated were seeking visas to work at science-focused charter schools. Officials had noticed that most of the applicants were generally evasive about their purpose of travel to the United States. And the only reason we know all this inside information is because it was revealed in a cable released by WikiLeaks last year. But it's only been since 2009 that news reports have come out about a possible tie between the Gulen movement and some charter schools. A lot of people still don't know about this, and one of the main reasons is because the Gulen movement intentionally keeps itself nebulous and under the radar. But although there has not been much awareness in the U.S. about the Gulen movement's charter schools, major Turkish daily newspapers have reported on their existence. For instance, readers of one Turkish newspaper were informed in 2010 that the Walton Family Foundation had donated $2 million to Gulen's charter schools in California. Okay? Before I go on, I want to talk about the xenophobia and Islamophobia concerns that come up whenever the Gulen movement is discussed. A charge that often gets made about people who are concerned about the Gulen movement is that they are xenophobic and that they are specifically hostile to Turkish people. Members of the movement and their sympathizers react in this way, as do people who don't know much about the Gulen movement in the first place. What you need to know is that many people living in Turkey are also extremely worried about what the Gulen movement is doing. This group has worked hard to become powerful, one of the most powerful and influential forces within Turkish society, but a lot of Turks have learned to be afraid of it. When 60 Minutes traveled to Turkey to collect information for their report, they, and I quote, confronted real fear, particularly when we've tried to get critics to give us an interview. And in a March New Yorker article about the Turkish prime minister, it was stated that Gulen, quote, is reviled and feared by much of Turkey's population. Of course, the Gulenists reject those views and deny any wrongdoing, but these types of statements indicate just how controversial and feared the Gulen movement is within Turkey itself. It is true that some people who speak out against the Gulen movement's charter schools also say that the movement is somehow involved with trying to set up this country for Sharia law, or that they are linked to terrorism some way. Those claims are completely unsubstantiated. The Eagle Forum, Liberty Linked, and West Texas Patriots and various other Tea Party type groups are definitely alert to these schools. I think it's because their antenna perk up for anything that has to do with Muslims. I do not identify with the views of those groups at all, and I mostly found they haven't put in the effort to study the specifics of the Gulen movement, so they end up saying things that are grossly inaccurate. But just because some people aren't getting it right is not a good reason for others to brush aside the fact that a tight-knit, secretive, and controversial brotherhood from Turkey is indeed operating U.S. charter schools in stealth. Here's something interesting I have found. In some ways, the Christian right and the Gulen movement have a lot in common. They're both extremely conservative. As an example, in 2007, Christian creationist advocates traveled to Istanbul to attend a conference organized by the Gulen movement to help link the two groups in their fight to bring creationism to schools in their respective countries. In Turkey, the Gulen movement has been lobbying for school textbooks to put creationism on equal footing with Darwinism. One view I definitely support was expressed by a Harvard professor from Turkey who is deeply troubled by the Gulen movement activities in his homeland. He said that the U.S. media has focused too much on the Islamic nature of the Gulen movement when the real concern is shady dealings and improprieties. And his assessments definitely rang true for me. That's what I've learned. For instance, in 2010, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported that these schools were being investigated by 3 federal agencies, the FBI, the Department of Education, and the Department of Labor. I've communicated with people who've told me they were interviewed by the FBI. And ever since I basically stumbled into the subject and started studying and posting about it, I've periodically heard from parents and teachers from Gulen charter schools who found my blog and wrote to me because they wanted to share their experiences and concerns. Perhaps because of heightened awareness since the 60 Minutes piece, in the past 2 months, a rash of teachers have contacted me, including one from a private Gulen school abroad. I know a U.S. attorney's office that is tracking this situation, so I referred these teachers to that office. The point I want to make is that the Gulen movement's heavy involvement in charter schools is no one's imagination, and neither are the concerns. Along with much discussion and open debate to sort things out, this issue deserves to have more heightened public awareness, a deep level of local, regional, and national investigation, and closer monitoring by all. I mean, this is my whole point. I do anything is to try just to get people to know that this group exists. So now I just want to give you some background information. I do apologize for not knowing how to pronounce Turkish correctly, and learning that's on one of my lists of things to do. I, however, would not go to Turkey right now because they actually are considered to run the national police. And they know who I am. The Gulen movement originated in Turkey. Its members are followers of Fethullah Gulen, a Turkish imam who would travel around and give sermons at mosques in the late 1960s, kind of like evangelists in a way, you know. In the late 1960s, he started to gather a group of serious followers. Some of them eventually produced pamphlets and recordings of his teachings, and that helped to spread Gulen's message and increase the number of his followers. In 1998, Gulen fled from Turkey to the U.S. He's now in his early 70s and has been living on a secluded compound in rural northeastern Pennsylvania for the past 14 years, having acquired a green card in 2008. How his presence in the U.S. came to be is a whole other story, but I will mention that part of that story involves the submission of letters from former CIA members to a federal judge in support of Gulen's appeal after the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration Services denied him a green card. Okay, appealed, CIA member, Okay. Gulen's followers refer to him as their, a word, Hokafendi, it's their honored master. They refer to themselves as Hizmet, meaning volunteer services movement. I happen to have a hard time understanding how getting an H-1B visa or a green card along with a decent guaranteed salary plus benefits, even for spouses, for coming to work at a school in the U.S. can be called volunteerism. Maybe Gulen adopted his framing from the Peace Corps program. But as far as I know, these volunteers don't go to great lengths to hide their affiliation to the Peace Corps. At least Peace Corps volunteers don't. The Gulen movement members do. Anyway, in Turkey, this group is widely referred to as the community. Gulen's followers believe that by participating in the movement's activities, they're contributing to the improvement of the world. They put most effort into the development of their schools. Their big focus is their schools. That is, in addition to their schools, the Gulen movement is engaged in 3 other main types of activities. They basically do these 4 things, the schools. They also operate a vast media empire that disseminates their political propaganda. They operate the largest newspaper in Turkey right now. They operate an enormous number of organizations, they operate organizations that advance the interests of Turkish capitalism and the businesses of their members. And they operate an enormous number of organizations around the world that proclaim to conduct interfaith dialogue and or promote Turkish culture. The Gulen movement is a highly coordinated global phenomenon. Historically, recruitment has taken place at the movement's tutoring centers and schools. The leaked cable from WikiLeaks said, and I quote, "We have multiple reports that the Gulenists use their school network, including dozens of schools in the U.S., to cherry-pick students they think are susceptible to being molded as proselytizers. And we have steadily heard reports about how the schools indoctrinate boarding students." Now, 60 Minutes interviewed an American journalist who has been living in Turkey for decades, who admitted that he thought the Gulen movement was a personality cult. The movement has been called cult-like quite a number of times, but some people are starting to refer to it as a new religious movement. Scholars have almost unanimously adopted that term as a neutral alternative to the word cult. To date, most members of the Gulen movement are Turkish because this is where Gulen schools have operated for the longest time. A smaller number of members are from Central Asia because that's where the movement first set up schools outside of Turkey. It was after the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991 that the Gulen movement began to fan out across the globe. One thing to know is that the Gulen movement has a reputation for it being extremely secretive. The New Republic article I mentioned earlier quoted a Turkish observer as saying, "No society would tolerate this big of organization being this untransparent." One expert has said that the members are, quote, "often loath to declare themselves openly as such." Another reported that members publicly deny affinity or membership with the movement. This secrecy can be seen in how the charter school operations are being conducted and how school representatives respond when questioned. It can also be seen in how the movement draws outsiders into participating in their activities without being upfront about who they are. One researcher called the Gulen movement's approach a strategy of seduction. Another expert said that the worldwide extent of the Gulen movements of the Fethullah Gulen's educational network testifies to the internationalist, even imperialist nature of the movement. A Turkish journalist who is friendly with the movement wrote, students, that the reason that they're operating is that students will learn how to speak Turkish, the national anthem, and how to be the right kind of Muslim, and since it buys them loyalty. They're largely secular here, but there are funny things that go on, like there are prayer rooms that have been reported at some of the schools, and there's a school in New York that taught some of its students how to do the whirling dervish dance, which is a Sufi religious ritual that's meaningful to the Gulenists, because that's kind of the type of Turkish Islam that they are connected with. And I'll tell you a little bit about how the schools are staffed, because American teachers are being excluded from these schools. In 2010 alone, Gulen charter schools in California, 2010, okay, Gulen charter schools in California applied for 92. H-1B visas, and 20 green cards. Doesn't mean that this website that reports that, it doesn't reflect how many they actually got, but that's how many they applied for. Like all charter schools, the Gulen charter schools are fully supported with public money, but they are run by non-elected individuals who sit on private boards. The vast majority of founders and board members are Turkish men, often highly educated, especially in computer and physical science fields. The few non-Turkish Turkic board members are usually co-workers, American spouses using maiden names, or people who the Gulen movement has taken on one of their guided propaganda trips to Turkey. Administrators, business managers, and IT personnel are also all Turkish men. In other words, control of the schools is strictly maintained by individuals or part of the Gulenist in-group. Part of the deal for charter schools is that they can hire who they want, and they don't have to adhere to the same rules as traditional public schools or get subjected to as much oversight. Almost all the teachers hired for science, math, computer instruction at these schools are here on H-1B visas. The schools refers to those teachers as international teachers, but they're all from Turkey and a few are from Central Asia. The charter schools have been criticized for importing so many teachers, but they defend their practice by claiming that they're unable to find qualified Americans. Around the world, local teachers are usually hired for elementary grades and the non-Gulen favored subjects. However, imported teachers, Turkish teachers, have also been assigned to English language learner and PE classes. I'm almost done. In other countries, concerns have arisen about the schools being used to recruit members and spread Turkish culture and fundamentalist religious ideas. Some of the countries like Uzbekistan does not like these schools. They're not, okay. The concerns raised about the charter schools and the Gulen movement network have related to questionable admission practices, the channeling of school funds to close associates, participation in biased Gulen movement created competitions, incidents of bribing, using the schools to generate political connections, science fair projects being done by teachers, so they can boast those on the website, unfair hiring and termination practices, and more. Basically, the schools engage in the kind of trickery that's been opened to other charter schools, that's been opened to the door to other charter schools so they can gain advantage over other schools, stay in business, and also grow. And also so they can spread the wealth of public education funding to their friends and associates. So there are vast dimensions of this, so if you want to learn more, a good place to start is on my websites.
But I did want to talk about what the face of privatization looks like in the CSU, and kind of use it as a case study in a way. I'm not going to talk about who the villains are, although it's the same crowd that you heard about here. The Gates influences there, the Lumina Foundation, Pearson, same people. But I thought it might be interesting to talk about how it affects students and what it means for them and their education, and therefore, for what it means for the state of California and any kind of equity and equality in higher education. And what it means is tragic, really. It really has, the whole privatization movement has been very subtle in some ways in the CSU. We call it stealth privatization. It's not like they stand up and say, we're going to sell this campus today, who can pay the most. It's much more subtle, and it's much more along the lines of emulating for-profit higher education corporations and using that model to build a new CSU. The result is a profound change. I've taught in the CSU for 30 years. If any of you went there 10 years ago, it's not the same place anymore. The effect on its mission to provide affordable, accessible, quality higher education that is so dear to those of us who went there and teach there is being wiped out. That mission, you hear politicians mouth it, but it's not the reality anymore. And it's been very hard. I appreciate the compliment to CFA. It is our main project. We realize it's kind of at the core of everything that's problematic right now. So we do spend a lot of time on it. But I have to say, it really is a hard thing
to fight. And part of it, I mean, some of it's kind of obvious. It's hard to fight it anywhere in this day and age. The rap of kind of the for-profit higher ed folks is very, very seductive. And we've had a hard time kind of wrapping our heads around, how to counter that without looking like you're anti-progress or a self-interested faculty member who wants to stay in that ivory tower, wherever that is. So it's been a challenge to figure it out. And towards the end, I'll say just a little bit about what we've figured out needs to be done by all of us to make a difference. The irony is we had been told as faculty in the CSU for at least 20 years, or at least 20 years, that we should be looking at some of these more innovative models of higher education. And we were told, that we weren't innovative, and we were told that some of these other models, these for-profits, were more efficient. They were much more student-centered than someplace like the CSU. It's now kind of bitterly ironic, now that we do know what the for-profits did to students and did to access. But we were told that, and that is the model. We're starting to resemble every day more and more a Phoenix or some of these other for-profits. We wrote the report to try to start getting kind of an alternative discourse, a different conversation going on about some of the changes that are taking place in CSU. It doesn't cover everything by any stretch of the imagination. That is part of the privatization project. But we wanted to have kind of that large frame of privatization, because it does feel some days like all we ever do is complain about what management wants to do. And it's not just that we have a bad attitude, it is that everything they want to do is part of this larger privatization. Same with all of us. So I hope you'll steal from it. If you find anything helpful in that report, I hope you will steal and go forth. One of the big raps of the for-profits has always been that they're about access. Those poor, they always focus on people of color, folks who don't get appreciated in other colleges have a place in Phoenix or Kaplan or any of these kinds of places. That rap was total crap. We know what the loan student debt problems have done to students. We know what the price of these degrees that are so-called access is exorbitant. The tragedy is very, very much out there, but the model is not going away. They managed to recreate themselves, and they're certainly creating a model for the CSU. If you look at executive compensation, we've spent a lot of work in CFA on that. Model is not public service. We have a chancellor who is not the brightest bulb in anybody's chandelier, who makes more than the President of the United States, for example. And even Barry Brown came out and said, I refuse to believe that you can't find a campus president who will work for less than a Supreme Court justice in the United States. But the model is, they will tell you they have to compete with these for-profits to get quality people, and that has driven exorbitant increases. The model for tuition is no longer the math plan that you should be, if you're in the top third of your class, you should be able to go to college no matter what. Our tuition has quadrupled in the last decade. Family income has gone up 25%. The impact that has had on students and affordability and access to the CSU is untold, and up there with total tragedies. But I did want to focus just for a second, and I know we're jammed for time here, but on a couple of innovations that are underway in the CSU that are pure privatization and very, very, very insidious. And they're going on all, any college or university campus, public one right now. And for us, it's the huge explosion or growth they're trying to create in so-called extended education. which is this shadow university, not public. It is the private arm of CSU. And, food service, extended education courses, all of this stuff runs over on that side of the house. The expansion is by their own admission, that they're planning huge expansions all over the place, all over the state of California. And they're touting it as access. Budget times are bad, but we're not going to give up on the CSU mission of access. We're going to offer these courses through extended ed. Fine print is terrible. The tuition is vastly greater than the already vastly increased tuition on the public side of the house. Right now, it'll cost you $6,000 to get a degree per year on the state side. But if you can't get those courses and you need to go over and take them in extended ed, the same coursework will cost you $16,000. So the cost is enormous. The tuition is set by the campus, not by the Board of Trustees in the public eye where the media are reporting on it. So there's no accountability for who the bums are charging students this. No transparency at all. Financial aid, a lot of people don't realize this. On the extended ed side of the house, Pell Grants are usable, but none of the state monies can be used by students for financial aid. So the story on what's going to happen with loans for students who find themselves stuck over there is predictable. I mean, we saw what happened in the for-profits, and it will happen here too. Cal State Online is one permutation of their extended ed thing. It's all on the private side of the university. It's all online. And, as was pointed out earlier, nobody's asking the question except grumpy old faculty who are anti-innovation, I guess, about whether this medium of instruction is really the best for the students that need the CSU the most and for whom there is no other place. If they don't get a four-year degree here, they're just not going to get one. So, for example, the management thinks remediation is really perfect for Cal State Online. Get it off the book so we don't have to pay for it. But nobody wants to hear questions about whether that's really the best medium for students who may be underprepared and usually are, given the state of public funding for K through 12. Nobody wants to hear that. And we already have some tragic tales about what that means. In Bakersfield, an administrator decided in one of these bad budget years that was the way to do math, remedial math. He took several hundred students who had been in these small classes with toiling teachers to get them up to snuff on the math, put them in one online course, and of course the success rate went below the floor, and those students were kicked out, because if you don't get remediated in a year, you're kicked out of the CSU. So it's definitely privatization. The model is definitely the for-profits, and it takes a lot to fight back. Last couple of sentences. Ways we've tried to fight back, or what we feel like we have learned about fighting back, is it really is important to have a frame that counters their frame. Just ad hoc kind of critiques of different initiatives is a loser. Media doesn't care about it. So we all need to work on, how do we frame what's going on? And we've tried to do it around the for-profit history already, and what this will mean for students, and what it is meaning for students. Collective bargaining, for those of us who are in unions, is really, really important. It's frustrating sometimes that you can't address everything they're doing directly in collective bargaining, but I can know for sure that if in our union, or in our institution, if they didn't have to pay us a certain amount of money, extended ed would be, expanding a lot faster. So maintaining the wages of workers through collective bargaining is a little bit of a pushback, and an important one. we've tried very hard to be strategic and think about legislation that can help. So for example, we got a bill passed that for the first time requires them to tell you give you information about what's happening on the private side of the house in terms of how much money they're collecting, what are they doing with all that money they get from students in the Taco Bells and in the courses and all of that up until now has been private. And we've also, lastly, worked a lot with students, and I think any of us in education, particularly higher education, I know it's easier, need to do more of that. You know, the students get it. They're the best messengers for this kind of fight. And I'll end with one example. Our students are very, very creative, and we do have a student intern program in CFA that tries to give them some skills and some opportunities to take their fight public. And just recently, they were on a hunger strike about the tuition thing, and got a lot of press. Same time, the chancellor decides to give the president some more pay increases and to have a big party that night at his house. So the students show up on a hunger strike to these fat cat house where all these people are going in for this gala, and it was a lovely picture of kind of the face of privatization in the CSU. So we should all be working with our students as much as we can. Thanks.
I would like to mention a couple of things before I jump right into a presentation. As you can see, I have a lot of things spread over here. That's because I taught elementary school for 4 years. I taught in South Central Los Angeles, second grade, for 2 years during the 1980s with the arrival of newly arriving immigrants from Central America as a result of the dirty wars that were carried out by this country. I've taught 17 years at Allen Hancock Junior College, which is one of the 112 junior colleges in California. And I've taught online, embarrassingly to say this, for close to 20 years. I began online teaching in 1993 when it was first begun, and have been in and out of that system for a while, but know where I speak when it comes from due to online education. I taught with the California Youth Authority prison system to first and second degree murderers for a year, and I'm a public interest lawyer who stopped practicing public interest law when there was no longer an interest in the public. And I became a kindergarten teacher as opposed to practicing law. However, I am eligible and active as a lawyer, though I do not practice much more anymore. There is no justice in law. The justice that we seek is amongst ourselves in the communities we put together and the way that we choose to produce and reproduce our lives. A couple of points that I'd like to make that I'd heard. We are no longer, as Susan would probably agree, no longer in the ivory halls of education. We're in the slave quarters. And there's a reason for that. We used to look at youth in this country as our future. We used to look at young people as the people that would be standing up for a new world, and we now demonize our young people. We look at them as commodities or consumers or at worst criminals to be vilified and to put into jail and prison. And therefore what we have done is we have reduced our future to nothing. We have taken our children and we have replaced childhood with adult bewilderment. And therefore, we have children without childhood. We have schools without playgrounds. And we have futures without hope. And this is a situation that has been going on for quite a while. I heard the name Reed Hastings mentioned. You might have gotten a notice that Reed Hastings has just asked for a settlement for $9 million for ripping off everybody's privacy information on Netflix, which he then turned around and sold to private corporations. This is the same man that talks about morality and education and preparing schools for the future. He's an organized criminal. I mean, let's just put it this way. All right? Privatization of education is organized crime, and therefore we need to be changing the narrative. All right? For-profit colleges are not for-profit colleges. They're subprime colleges, disaster colleges, criminal organizations that should be indicted under RICO. When we begin to think like this, we change the narrative, and we begin to see these people for what they really are. They are our mafia. All right? They take an oath of omerta when they go into certain rooms. Now, they may not draw blood, but they promise to each other that they will not make anything public, that there will be no disclosure, that there will be no transparency. The second thing that I'd like to mention is the last thing. All right, well, let's put it this way. Four executives in Walmart, 4 Walmart family members, have the combined income of 48 million Americans. Right? 40 families in this country have the combined income of 150 million Americans. The problem in this country, education is one dysfunctional institution amongst many. If you were nurses here today, you'd be talking about the privatization of hospitals and nursing care. You'd be talking about nurse ratios and patient ratios. All right? So education is just one dysfunctional institution amongst many. We can't isolate it out and think we can fix education. The system is not broke. The system is fixed. And when we understand that the system is not broke and that it is fixed, then we will be on the road to begin to breathe new dreams and new templates of how to live in this world. And we will begin to confront power with solidarity. And that's why I call on all of you to think of what we're fighting for is K through 16 education, or pre-K through 16 education, including adult education. We have had a tendency to talk about K-12 and then bifurcate that from higher education and then bifurcate that from adult education and then that from homeschool or whatever it happens to be. It's the same morass. It's a corporate mosh pit that we're being carried through, all right? And we must see it that way, because it's only through solidarity that we're going to beat it, if we can beat it at all. I want to share just a couple of startling statistics to you, and then we'll get into some of the stuff we have some time for. I hope that at a time we'll have more time for dialogue, debate, and discussion. Didactic education or lecturing doesn't work for students. It doesn't work for participants. It doesn't work for activists. And I'm not critiquing our format here in total. I'm just saying that hopefully we can expand. There are some startling statistics that are out now I would like to share with you. The average real economic growth for the United States has gone from the 1960s up to, let's say, 50%, we're down to less than 20% when it comes to economic growth rates in the United States. Okay, all of this is an attempt to seat what I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Our industrial production index, in other words, how much we produce, and this is all government statistics. Our industrial production index, we're down below 20%, we're about 15%. We don't produce anything in this country anymore. We don't produce anything except problems, troubles, financiers, hucksters, hustlers, hoaxsters, whatever you want to call them. But in terms of goods and services, we don't produce anything here anymore. We outsourced it. My next stunning statistic, all right? Because we don't produce anything in here anymore, our real investment in manufacturing structures has gone from 90% down to 0. We don't even invest in our manufacturing sector in this country anymore. The people that control the manufacturing means of production of this country, they don't invest in it. They let it rot. Right? That's why you go into Detroit or other places back east, you'll see dilapidated Rust Belt buildings. There's no reason to invest in them. Why invest in them when you can build them in China or in Asia or in Mexico or in other southern periphery global areas? So we produce nothing. What has this meant? This meant that there's a terrible dilemma for capitalism throughout the world. Capitalism and the capitalists have all this money, but they have no place to invest it. And if you can't invest capital for return to accumulate more investment, you're in real trouble. So why would we invest? If I was a capitalist, why would I start investing in the American people? The American people have no private savings. The American people don't have very much education. The American people don't have any money to consume anything. The American people don't have very much of anything. So why would I invest in this country? As a capitalist, it would be a foolish investment for me. Better for me to invest like the gangsters did, Sheldon Adelson, for example, who gave millions of dollars to the Republican Party. Better to invest in Macau or in China, or over where 300 million burgeoning middle-class people are starting to emerge in Asia. That's the entire population of the United States, all right? And that's where the majority of the investment is going. So where is the investment going in the United States? 65% of all investment in the United States is in the financial sector. It's called FIRE, and it basically means finance, insurance, and real estate. And therefore, with capitalists sitting on trillions of dollars that they don't know where to invest, what are they looking to do? They're looking to take over the $600 million educational market. And that's what it is. If they can break that Brazilian nut, which they're well on the way to doing, then they have a place where they can park their capital and accumulate tremendous amounts of profits. And that's exactly what they're doing right now. Now, this is all from it's called Monthly Review. I would just like to mention this because this is where you will find some of the first person to write for Monthly Review was Albert Einstein. It's been around since 1949. It's the leading economic journal in the United States. Our manufacturing capacity utilization right now, folks, is down to 74%. That means we have 26% of our factories that are not being used, and we have millions and millions of people unemployed. Capitalism doesn't work. The last thing the capitalist wants is an educated workforce. All right, as they say in Texas, if you educate the farm workers, who's going to pick the food? And that is exactly the situation in America today. They don't want you to be educated. They want instrumentality and functionalism. And I'm not going to go into these two terms, but they go back to the early 1900s. Bob touched on them a little bit, of preparing immigrant workforces for industrialization. We are now looking at schooling, not education. We don't educate under capitalism. We school. There's a big difference. Remember what Mark Twain said, "I'll never let schooling get in the way of my education." Remember what W.B. Du Bois said, all right? The role of education is not to make carpenters out of men, it's to make men out of carpenters, all right? And John Dewey, one of our great philosophers, said in his debate with Walter Lippmann last century, which is a very important debate that I would ask you to look at, and that is the following: we train animals, we educate human beings. We're being trained, folks. That's what our educational institutions have been converted into. Obedience camps with constables of obedience that will sit there and make sure that you're following the right morality, that you're not exposed to disenfranchised narratives, that you only hear the point of view of the conquerors and not the conquered, all right? That you only hear the ruling class ideology, not the ideology of the working class. I'd just like to give a quote here, and then I'll go right quickly into what I have to say, and I'll leave time for conversation, of course. Karl Marx, since he's been alluded to here, many of us in this country, as a result of the Soviet Union, which was one of the biggest mistakes of my judgment last century, don't really understand that Karl Marx was really not proposing socialism as much as he was critiquing capitalism. And that is really what he is to understand. He said something very, very important, and I quote, "The demand to give up illusions about the existing state of affairs is the demand to give up a state of affairs which needs illusions. We are living in an illusory state of affairs. What you see is not what it is. Scratch and sniff. Appearance is not reality. This is Plato's cave, all right? There are being shadows shown on the wall by puppeteers. And this is, of course, the role of the giant media. Now, just to stop at this point and to get into what we're talking about, some people call it e-learning, some people call it distance learning, some people call it online learning, some people call it cyber learning, okay? I call it e-earning, distance earning, online earning, and cyber earning. Why? because it's all about reducing the costs of labor. The highest cost for any capitalist in any endeavor is the cost of human labor. The benefits, the salary, the sick days, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you can automatize factories, replace workers with machines, then you have no benefits, no sick days, no problems with retraining workforces. That's what's going on in education right now, folks. We're seeing the automation of education, only it's called cyber education. They give it different names for subterfuge purposes, but what we're seeing is the automation of education, and that means less teachers, and less teachers. We will become call centers, where we'll walk around with telephones on our belts, answering calls from students in distress who we will never see in our lives, okay, because we work with them online. They will be calling us. They don't understand the material. There's nobody to talk to. There's no dialogue online. As Paulo Freire once said, without dialogue, there's no communication. Without communication, there's no learning. You don't communicate online by posting a Post-it note and then having somebody read your Post-it note and post another Post-it note. It's Post-it note learning. That's what it is. All right, and students are being, as we say in Yiddish, schmeicheled by it. They're being fooled by it. Why are they being fooled by it? Because they've been told they can point and click and lose weight. They can point and click and find a meaningful relationship with eHarmony. They can point and click and eat right. They can point and click and do this and that. And now they've been duped into thinking they can point and click and become educated citizens in a society that is falling apart. And unfortunately, that is just not true. You can't lose weight online. You can't find a mate online. All right? You're not going to find the greatest deals online, and you're certainly not going to get an education online. However, I'm not a Luddite, meaning that I realize that the technology is moving faster than our morality. Or as Martin Luther King once said, we have guided missiles and misguided men, and that's the situation we're in today. The means of production, as Marx would call them, and I think we need another language to begin to talk about what we're talking about. Otherwise, we're scattered all over. We have so many BBs in a bag, and we don't connect them up. The means of production in education used to be textbooks, and it used to be overhead projectors, and it used to be, you know, the things, the means, the things that you would use in a classroom. That's all changing now. It's all changing into automation. And so now we have Verizon's and jumped into the field. We've got Pearson's jumped into the field. Telecommunications and Hollywood will write the scripts for the videos that the children will watch, while the low-paid workers will watch over them to make sure they're watching the videos that Hollywood produces for them. And a small group of teachers will be crowd control managers. Okay? That's crowd control. This is really what we're looking at. It's crowd control. Traditional public schools, folks, as a result of the move in the means of technology, are going to be transformed. And I think we all have to just look reality and the illusions in the eye and say it as it is. Technology is changing the way we work. It is changing the way we pick in the fields. It'll change the way that we made cars, and it's going to change the way that we do education. Or as I say, we're in a situation right now where education does Walmart. You know, it's basically what we have right now. We have a Walmart approach to education. Low-paid workers, turnover rate of every 3 years, get them in, get them out, cheap products, cheap financial services, cheap educational products. And of course, all this is called cyber learning. In the United States in 2010, there were 48 states, including DCP, that had traditional public schools. 27 of those states allowed virtual charters. There are now 200,000 full-time students in charter schools. 1.5 million take at least one class in charter schools. I'm not talking just K through 12. Remember, the for-profit colleges, which I write out a lot on Truth Out, you might have seen some of my articles on Kaplan and some of the other criminal outfits that operate out there. And these have to be included too. When you add these in, all right, you're finding a situation in the United States because our public sector has been starved so much, people are looking for education, they're going online. You see, online's cheaper for the capitalists. They don't need labor. They don't need brick and mortar. They don't need overhead. They don't need lights. They don't need anything. They can operate out of Belarus, another country in the world. They don't even have to operate in the United States. According to the law right now, cyber schools can operate out of Belarus or out of Syria and teach children here. In fact, I would ask you to look at a book called Public Education PLC by Stephen Ball. He wrote it some time ago. Almost every civil service job and every social service agency in England has been contracted out to other countries. Dubai teaches 250,000 students in England, all right? The Middle East is taking over most of the English educational system, all right, as they begin to contract it out. Why? England doesn't want to pay for it anymore. They're not interested. They don't want an educated population. That's the last thing you would want if you controlled everything, is somebody asking you questions, right? Wouldn't that be the last thing you'd want? You want docile crowd of people that sit obediently and do what they're told. And that's what education is preparing us for here. The Connections Academy was mentioned. Yes, it was just bought by Pearson's. It is the second largest K through 12 delivery service for schools. But Connections Academy is very different from K-12 Inc. K-12 Inc. is the biggest, but K-12 Inc. has a public school connection and a private school connection. In other words, with K-12 Inc., K-12 Inc. will partner with public schools, and then they'll offer online classes. All right? Connections Academy doesn't do that. They built an entire virtual school system. Because you see, in the traditional schools that we have around here, to put in a virtual school system would mean one would have to go in, they'd have to tear up the ground, they'd have to put in optics, they'd have to, I mean, it's millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars to convert schools around here into virtual schools. Right? But if you have something like the Connections Academy that's already built their own virtual school system, their own clerical departments, their own grade books, their own access, teacher development, right? Then what they do is they just tap the public school on the shoulder and say, hey, look, we know that you know, that 92 cents out of every dollar SFCC is going toward, labor. You want to get rid of that labor? Hire us. Contract with us. You can get rid of all your labor costs. Right? And we'll come in and we'll run the school for you. And the students who graduate, they'll get a degree from your institution. But we'll come up with a curriculum. We'll come up with the teachers. We'll come up with the whole thing. It'll all be online. This is all subsidized with taxpayer money. You pay for it all. Were you asked whether you wanted to pay for it? No, of course you weren't asked. All right? You weren't asked when your money was taken out of the banks and put in a casino economy either. You weren't asked then either. Right? And you're not going to be asked. You're going to be told what to do. And this is, so this phony public-private partnership, let's break this apart, all right? A corporation has a fiduciary responsibility to its shareholders, not to its constituents, to its shareholders, to increase the amount of shareholder profits. So how could there be a public-private partnership when the public has a duty to its public and the corporation has a duty to its shareholders? You're telling me that we can have a public-private partnership? It's an oxymoron. It can't work. All right? Don't let this language fool you. There is no such thing as a public-private partnership. None whatsoever. The material conditions of educational production are changing. And what I mean by the material conditions of educational production, I mean the way that we produce and reproduce education. Our traditional schools are either disappearing, charters are taking their place. Charters are a Trojan horse for vouchers. Vouchers wouldn't sell in the 1990s, so they had to soften up the public by starving public education, pointing at it, saying, see, it doesn't work. Wouldn't you like something better called a charter? Then they got the charter schools, they're Trojan horses that they wheeled in, and the next will be, well, look, wouldn't you want the money to follow the kid instead of the money to follow the school? We'll give you $6,000. You go to Community Connections Academy. You can take your kid and you can bring him over to K through 12. What they don't tell you is that it costs $12,000, and so the subsidy is only half, and therefore your kid will not get an education at all. They'll be dumped into traditional public schools that are just shrinking and shrinking, holes in the roof, buckets underneath, rainwater coming through. I mean, this is what we're looking at here. This means the relations of productions is changing too, of educational production. The way we work as teachers is changing. Instead of collaboratively in the classroom, we sit isolated in broom closets, working on keyboards, trying to talk to people with our fingers who we've never seen in our lives and who we may never see. How do you do critical thinking about philosophy online? How do you ask questions and then turn around and say, what do you think about that, Juan? I'd be curious, Betty, what do you think about Juan just had to say? There's no forum for that. And even if there does exist a forum for that, the geographical locations that we're going to live with will have no human contact. There'll be no kinesthetic between us, all right? Everything is being reduced to informational text now online. Very little fiction's going on online. The humanities are disappearing in cyber learning. Why? Can't assess them. All right? They're not monological disciplines like math or science. When I say a monological discipline, I mean it only has this, there may be 100 people asking the question, but there's only one right answer. Is 2 + 2 5? Is it 6? Is it 9? There's only one right answer, it's 4. That I can do online, and I can get feedback. Okay, that's what Khan Academy does, if you've ever heard of them. They do science and math. How do you do that when you want to teach critical thinking? When you want to teach humanities? When you want to teach music? When you want to teach fine arts? You can't. And so they're going to be phased out for the instrumentality of what's needed to compete with China and India in the new economy where, of course, we're losing and we can't win because we spend everything we have on the military. And so as a result, we bankrupted our country. There will be, and the talk is in the right-wing literature, and I do encourage you to read it. It does say here, be ready. I think a lot of middle-tier institutions in the U.S. will collapse or merge in the next 10 years, is what one educator is saying. I agree with him. I think the state college system in California, for example, there is no middle class. Why do we need middle-class colleges? We'll have two-tier college system. We'll have the elites, the Harvards and the Stanfords, where people will go to the corridors of power, and they'll be able to network, and they'll be able to get themselves jobs when they get out of school. And then we'll have junior college, or vocational centers, or training centers for the rest of us. Why would a CSU, how can California afford a CSU system of 23 CSUs? Now, I just wrote an article on Cal State Sonoma that some of you might have read. $300 million in debt, and they only have 8,500 students. How did they get $300 million in debt? The president has an edifice complex. He's an Eastern Islander. He builds $1.5 million worth of construction. 1.5 square inches. 1.5 square inches of construction for 8,500 students at Sonoma State College. All right? So who's going to be able to go there? Well, we know who's going to be able to go there. We know what the plan is. Right? It's to bring the burgeoning middle class from Asia into the United States. They pay out of country fees. They don't need financial aid. There are no forms to fill out. They don't pay resident fees. Right? They pay 3 times the tuition. And that's who your colleges are going to start catering to. The Harvards, the Stanfords, all right, and the elite CSUs that happen to survive, like Sonoma State will survive because it's in wine country and it's really a Sanford Weill University right now. The former head of City Group really runs the university right now. So they will go, but then he will go outward and he'll look for rich, middle-class students from China and Asia to come in, and then they can have a California experience with wine and pay a lot of money, and so, but what happens to our, you see, we have a serpent closing here. There are so many ways that this is being done. Take, for example, Arizona. Arizona is now giving tax breaks for online profit colleges. They wanted to give a tax break of $33 million to the Apollo group who runs Phoenix. All right? But some people went up in arms, and so Brewer said, I can't give you a $33 million tax break, but I can give you a $3 million tax break. So because why? Well, very simple. Apollo said, we employ in your state approximately, what do they have here? They employ 12,000 employees in their state. They went to the governor of the state and they said, you give a tax subsidy or a tax break to us, but we're going to move our operations outside of your state. We'll take all of your 12,000 workers. They blackmail states now. There are no states. This is Rome. You live in territories. I live in a territory called California. Some people live in a territory called Indiana. All right? They're provinces of a large crumbling empire. And this is what's happening. So all of our money is being given away to these people because they threaten to relocate to right-to-work states. And so more and more states become right-to-work states. It's not a race to the top. It's a race to the slop. And that's where they're taking us, right to the slop. They're taking everything out of the trough they can get. They are asset stripping this country, my friends. They are taking everything. Asset stripping the entire country. They're selling off everything. And they're selling them off to international corporations. So don't be surprised when the Chinese, who are sitting on $2 trillion that they have absolutely no use for, come over to the United States on a spending spree. Just like the Japanese did in the 1980s and bought Rockefeller Square and other things else. The Chinese are already in Confucius schools in most of the major colleges in this country, and they're going to start buying up education. It's a great investment. I mean, it's compulsory, so your kid has to go. And each kid gets $7,500 to $10,000 to bring with them. And that goes right into the coffers of the corporations, which translates into higher stock prices. And you don't have to educate the kids. You can just show them videos and roll around carts that have games on them that have been made by other ancillary corporations that are owned by the larger corporations. All right? This is what's going on. So we're losing community, our brick and mortar is disappearing, our governance is done now by boards or for-profit organizations or non-profit organizations. That means no democracy, no disclosure, no transparency. Education is minimized in favor of autocracy, investment. Right? So here's what I'm saying. I'm saying automation. I'm seeing a reconstitution of labor. And so the fight, for example, to keep the schools open in Oakland, which I'm definitely for, the fight to keep the adult schools open, which you know I wrote about at Daily Censored about the adult schools to keep, I'm all for. But what I'm telling you, within the next 24 months, I'm saying 24 months, the whole situation is going to change like you've never seen in your life. And the schools will be closed left and right like vacant malls, folks, or turned into call centers or for-profit prisons, or utilized as real estate for something else, okay? The problem is not that Johnny can't read. The problem is that Johnny can't think. And until we start teaching people to think critically about the situations they find themselves in, to start challenging authority and asking if there's a better way to produce and reproduce our lives, we will see the continuation and the destruction of education worldwide. Right? There are $3 trillion worth of educational funds in the world internationally today. You don't think that Pearson and K-12 Inc. and all of them want to expand across borders? They'll abandon this country as fast as they can. They'll give up their passports. They already have 2-3 houses in other countries. They don't want to pay taxes here. Why should they? They don't care about you. They don't care about your children. They don't care about your neighborhoods. They don't use your roads. They don't use your schools. They don't use your transportation. They don't live with you. They don't drive with you. They don't go to the theater with you. Right? This is what we're living through, folks. In closing, and then I'll be finishing, I promise you. It was talked about, AT&T has partnered, yes, now with News Corp. Rupert Murdoch is in the educational business with AT&T. Google will be here soon. We'll be looking for Facebook. Verizon's already here. Hollywood's moving in. Pearson owns basically most all of it. Wall Street subsidizes it all, along with us and our taxpayer money. And it's growing. Now, there is a book that I would recommend you, Madeline, to mention. It's called The Shallows. It's just come out. How the internet is doing, what the internet is doing to our brains, all right? And this one gentleman says in here, he says, he says, and this is my aunt, he says, he's writing it, it's a gentleman by the name of Scott Karp. He's a very famous academician back east. And Karp said, he used to work for a magazine and now he writes a blog about online media. And he confesses he stopped reading books altogether. Quote, I was a lit major in college and used to be a voracious book reader. What happened? He speculates on the answer. Quote, what if I do all my reading on the web, not so much because the way I read has changed, I'm just seeking convenience. It's because the way I think has changed. And that's what we must understand. There are not just objective conditions that we're facing. We're facing the subjective conditions of the retooling of the human mind through the internet and the abandonment of community for isolated learning and alienated learning. There's been a lot of talk in the room about privatization, all right? So it's very important to define terms, all right? Privatization is not financialization. And financialization is very, very, it's not mentioned very much in the parlance of many people that are fighting privatization. There's corporatization, privatization, and financialization. Let me give you an example. First of all, it is built into the system. It is the way the economic system works. It's not a cabal of people that have sat somewhere and, you know, up in the Bavarians thinking of how they could, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's the logic of the economic system and the way it works. Capitalism has to accumulate capital. If it doesn't get bigger, it dies. If it dies, the system dies. That's the bottom line. And so in which case, financialization is where we're at right now. And here's an example that I'll give you. They privatize student loans, all right? So you can get a federal student loan, a Stafford at 3.4, though it may go up to 6.8, we don't know, but you get it to 3.4. But if that's not enough for your education, then you have to go out and you have to get a privatized student loan. They then take those student loans that are privatized, okay, and they call them student loan asset-backed securities, or slabs. This is like mortgage-backed securities.